Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
3, 2, 1, and we're live. Hey, Kristy, how are you?
I'm feeling fantastic. How are you, Nick?
Very good. Thank you so much for joining us on our first episode of the Ethics Expert. We've been real excited to get you on here, so thanks for making some time for us.
Absolutely.
How are you? How's your year getting off to? Is your year getting off to a good start or what?
It's fantastic. You know, I'm usually London-based, but I'm spending January in California, particularly because the weather's horrible, but also because I'm doing a lot of CCPA work right now, the California Consumer Privacy Act. So very hot here in California in that respect, and very warm, which makes me happy too.
Yeah, so that's a win-win. California gets the benefit of your expertise, and you get the benefit of their expertise in weather.
Excellent. Yes.
So why don't we dive into that? I'd love to hear about some of the challenges that you're helping folks face with the CCPA that's on a lot of people's minds right now as they're trying to adjust.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a really interesting law. I think that we didn't really have a lot of clarity on it until about September, October, when the amendments came out and the legislature and the government here finally gave us a lot more clarity. But we don't have all of the clarity yet at all. And I think that a law that came into place on January 1st is really challenging when all of the bugs aren't written out of it yet. But we are not going to see enforcement, we're told, until the end of sort of July. So hopefully we've got some time to get ourselves all put together. But I said earlier, we're London, Los Angeles, and Atlanta based. And the London folks, so many of our multinationals are in good shape if they've got GDPR compliance already put together. Those that don't have GDPR compliance are in a little bit more of a disadvantage. But what's interesting to me really is just how many states are contemplating these kind of laws. Recently found out that over 100 countries currently have data privacy laws, which means, of course, that 95 or so don't. And those that don't are probably contemplating it. So I think that we're getting a sort of coalescence of what's happening in the data privacy world, but we haven't got that figured out yet.
And so you kind of divided the world into sort of two different categories, people who've had to make some adjustments for GDPR and those who haven't. What sort of challenges do you think the people who haven't done anything yet are facing right now?
Well, the biggest problem is that they probably haven't done a data inventory or a data audit, as they're called, which is where you find out where all your data is, which systems have it, which third parties either have it or it's being sold to. And that exercise is horrible for most companies.
Yes.
It's a gigantic, horrible thing where you're contacting HR and IT and sales and marketing. You know, where's the data? Where does it go? If somebody contacts me with a California consumer request to find out where my data is or to delete it, how do I even know where to find it? So with the GDPR, that exercise for most companies has been done.
Right.
So the CCPA becomes, okay, we need a separate policy, we need to do some training, we need to figure out how to respond to these kind of consumer requests, but likelihood of it being as onerous is significantly less. If you haven't done that, it's a lot worse.
Yeah. How much overlap, in your opinion, is there? Is there 95% overlap? Is there 50% overlap? Is it really just kind of, hey, I have all my GDPR stuff and I just need this specific policy for CCPA and I can just kind of tweak what I have in place? What sort of like high level guidance would you provide to any Rip Van Winkles who've been sort of sleeping under a tree for a while?
Right. The biggest thing is the policy. The policy has a lot of prescriptive elements to it. So GDPR is quite prescriptive in what needs to be in that policy. GDPR generally has a lot more requirements, things like privacy by design and privacy impact assessment processes that have to be in place, requirements for a data privacy officer, depending on what kind of company you are, whether you meet the thresholds for that, and really having data breach protocols put in place. CCPA really only deals with how you're dealing with consumers and whether, which is usually considered what you would expect it to be right now, which is a customer, although that may change in a year. If it actually starts to apply to employees, then that nightmare gets much bigger.
Oh yeah.
GDPR applies to everybody, basically,
right,
including your employees. So it's a really, the things you need to do high level are making sure you've got that policy, attached to your homepage, that's got how to ask for these pieces of information, what categories of information are being collected. If you sell information, making sure you have a do not sell button. And GDPR is just a lot more prescriptive. And in California, I think, is going to be the canary in the coal mine for even more of these kinds of laws that are coming out.
So if I don't know if you were able to get your crystal ball through security when you flew over, but if you like look forward, what do you think, like how do you think this is going to continue? Because I think, to what you said earlier, I think this is kind of the tip of the iceberg. I think the GDPR was sort of the first mover, and then we're going to see a lot of this stuff continue across different states and across different countries. Do you feel like as this spreads through the United States, do you think, I mean, it'll probably be on a state-by-state basis, I would imagine, but how do you see it sort of bleeding from just the consumer piece to that more holistic, approach that GDPR covered?
Look, I think that previously we had some pretty terrific opportunity to maybe have the FTC in the United States give a singular law, and that's just never how we've done this on a federal level with respect to privacy. I think that most experts agree that ship may have sailed, and it's going to be done on a statewide basis. Washington's already got movement for its law. What's interesting to me is I think that there will be two parts of the world. I think most of the world will go the GDPR route and try to get acceptance as having adequate protections under the law, so it's easier to transfer data without one of the European data mechanisms in place. Stateside, I think that we're going to see 50 different laws by the time in 25 years we'll have 50 different laws. And what's interesting to me is, so the New York legislature this last session had a law that it was trying to get passed that wasn't passed, but what it has is a private right of action. And if we get that in, that's going to be nightmarish for most companies, which means individuals can sue them if they have data breaches and if they have misuse of their data or mishandling of their data. Right now, the California law is really about the Attorney General's power. And if we start to give that to all kinds of citizens, I think you're going to see, more class actions and giant issues with the plaintiff's bar coming in and suing quite a bit. So I think there will potentially be almost a one-upmanship for my law is harder than your law.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what I was hoping you weren't going to say, but thought you would say. And I just wonder, as a sidebar, at some point you're kind of a Londoner, or you're in, you're starting to become British. Is the insanity on stateside starting to become more and more apparent, or do you feel like you've always kind of seen how crazy things can become over here?
I mean, so I am now a British citizen. I've been in Britain for 8 years. And there's such a learning curve when you go over there about what data privacy is and how it means. I mean, when I come to the States, I have been shocked at just how many, I'm trying to buy, lipstick from the store, and they tell me they need my phone number. And I'm like, I'm paying cash for lipstick. Why do you need my phone number? I don't understand. People just hand them out all the time. What's your zip code? What's your email? Can I email you the receipt and then put you on my marketing list without asking if I can? I mean, the kind of ways that Americans just hand out their private information is frankly kind of shocking to me. I think that's shifting. I think there is a lot more comprehension of why privacy is important. And there is a rush, I think, in the legislature, almost like, 20 years ago when there was a tough on crime stuff and every single legislature made longer prison sentences and mandatory minimums and all those things that are now being reevaluated. I think that privacy is going to take that same path, and it will be challenging for companies. I think they need to prepare now, particularly with their data audit or inventory and their data maps, because it's not going to get easier, certainly in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, how do you even plan for it? I mean, I'm just picturing it, and I just feel like what you described is exactly what's going to happen, and you're going to have all these different states. And I mean, just think of think of a business that is spanning multiple states, and they have to adhere to all those different things. It's a very, it can be a very onerous thing that's probably going to be coming down the pike. Do you think we'll start to see companies or organizations really just kind of try to develop their own policies that are really kind of a lowest common denominator, or maybe highest common denominator, to adhere to the most likely kind of worst case scenario laws, or what?
I think you're going to see a lot of variations on GDPR. So if I were, well, I do when I'm advising clients, it's let's get this GDPR style process in place. I also recommend doing training that is really principles based for the most part. So
Hmm.
it's kind of like with the federal sentencing guidelines and the UK Bribery Act guidance and the ISO standards, we've really decided what's in a good compliance program, right? You've got training, you've got policies, you've got governance, you've got metrics and monitoring and auditing. It's all very much, this is what we know makes a good compliance program. I think similarly with privacy, what you get is we need the principles based of transparency. We want consent for doing marketing. We want to know what you're doing with my data, and I need to know upfront what it's going to be. I need to know that there's good security around it. I need to be able to access information about what the heck you're doing with it, and to be able to delete and basically withdraw my consent for your use. So I think that if you get a principles-based training system where you add on pieces for CCPA or GDPR where it's required, that you're really going to be in a better position than trying to start over with CCPA training that's completely different from GDPR. I think that if you look at it as a principles-based exercise, that's really the way to go.
Yeah, and that actually, I don't know. I think I was kind of thinking about it from like a bottom-up standpoint, like, oh, I got to adhere to Delaware and I got to adhere to, all these different states that I'm in. But I think you're right. That top-down approach of kind of these principles that then can just sort of be applied in these different situations. You don't have to necessarily even be able to articulate all those different situations, but these sort of principles can guide you as they come up, or as this law is in place. That's actually probably a way more efficient way to think about it, and it's actually makes it a lot more manageable.
Yeah, we try to be efficient here. It's our MO, our approach at Spark Compliance Consulting is pragmatic. So
Right.
it's the only way I think to do it. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in the weeds for the rest of time.
So, listen, I am so glad to get you on here. I'm so excited for you to be our first guest. You put that book out that really has had a huge impact on me and a lot of folks on our team, because I think you really articulated a lot of what I think is lacking, and I think a lot of what kind of keeps ethics and compliance folks sort of pigeonholed in the spots that they're in. So I can't imagine anyone doesn't know who you are at this point, but I'd love to, if you just kind of talked a little bit about your background and a little bit of the ethos of your book, because I just love it. I just think it's such an empowering tool, and I think when people hear your story, it kind of makes sense how your approach is manifest in both your consulting business and again in that book.
Sure. Well, so I started my life as a Californian in theater, film, and television. My degree is from UCLA. Went into theater and film and basically wanted to figure out a way to get paid to travel. So I decided, literally, I'm like, how do I get paid to travel and get paid better than I do in film and television? So I went to law school and got my degree, and the answer to that question was go into anti-bribery work because it's all foreign. So I started to do corporate monitorships and FCPA work, defense work at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, and they moved me to London in 2011 to work on a banking scandal in London and Switzerland. And I unexpectedly, to me, got married to a Brit. So I ended up deciding to go into compliance at that point because I'd had this data privacy work with trying to figure out how to get documents out of Switzerland and the UK, as well as the FCPA work and then competition issues. And it all just led to compliance. So started at literally the first recruiter that said, have you considered compliance? I was like, what now? I never even considered it, as a career. But it was such a good fit for me. So I became the director of compliance for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa at Carlson Wagonly Travel, and was then recruited to be the chief compliance officer at United International Pictures, which is the joint venture of Paramount and Universal Pictures in 35 countries.
Kind of full circle there.
65 countries. That's
wow.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, actually it was pretty neat. I went to interview at UAP, and they had the restaurant was called 555 Melrose, which is the address of Paramount Pictures in Los Angeles, which was my first job.
Oh my gosh.
It was incredibly cool. But yeah, so when my first book was coming out, which is How to Be a Wildly Effective Compliance Officer, I decided that was the right moment to start the consulting company, which has expanded from just me in London out into back into Los Angeles, which kind of makes sense, and then Atlanta now as well. So yeah, we focus on risk assessments, compliance program evaluations, obviously privacy, as we've been talking about. And really my approach comes from that experience as being a CCO, that everything has to be pragmatic or it's useless. And the book is about influence, persuasion, and motivation. So it's all about the human side of using, frankly, sales techniques a lot of the time. A bunch of the techniques came from David Sandler and from Zig Ziglar, and reading about how to sell, which is ultimately part of what we do.
Well, I think it's so as I got into this game, I kind of have a sales background and a finance background, and my parents were both salespeople. And that's something that I really kind of realized very quickly, that a lot of these things that I sort of took for granted, that were just what I thought were just the way that you just work and communicate, you know, this kind of basis of persuasion. Because at the end of the day, we're working with people and we're selling ideas. And, you know, Zig Ziglar, as I was reading your book, there was so much Zig Ziglar stuff. And you know, I remember going on, you know, car trips with my dad, and this was back when there were tapes, and we were just listening to these Zig Ziglar tapes. So a lot of the quotes and stuff like really resonated with me. But I just, as I got into this game, I started to see that like a lot of those capabilities, or a lot of those persuasion techniques, they weren't in, you know, they weren't arrows in the average sort of ethics and compliance person's quiver. And I think that kind of speaks to, you know, why there's some of that check the boxedness, if I can make a word up, or a lot of that pigeonholing that occurs, because it's almost like folks aren't as well equipped as they could be to kind of break out of that mold and tell a good compliance story and show how, you know, yeah, we're doing these things, and yeah, you know, we have a seatbelt on the car, but as a matter of fact, because of us, we also have a spoiler on the car, and this is helping to push this car forward more. So I just loved the book. I just recommend it to everybody that I can. And I just, I don't know, I think it's a great thing. And, you know, it's kind of this interesting thing from my standpoint, because, you know, with your background in, you know, in theater and in film and so forth, and then you sort of jumped the fence over into this compliance realm, which again seems like diametrically opposed. It was an interesting way for you to kind of bring this storytelling and persuasion into the mix. What sort of response have you seen from folks as this has, you know, become more and more popular over the years?
I am so gratified. I get, so I've written 3 books and then co-authored and edited one on GDPR. And the first book is the one everyone wants to talk about, you know. It really, I think at the time, particularly when it came out 5 years ago, was very groundbreaking with respect to crossing over between the human side and the compliance side. And I think that I hope that it's shifted the dialogue a bit, and that it gives people, you know, real tools. I've done a lot of public speaking now and professional speaking with different companies and conferences globally. And I think that it's an important voice in the compliance world, because we absolutely need the hard skills, right? We need to understand all the privacy pieces and the latest enforcement actions. But if without the human piece, we'll never be effective.
Yeah, and we're you know, it's, when you boil all of this stuff down, it's all humans at the end of the day. So it's the name of the game. You know, to your point, until we can all in this industry be, you know, have that cohesive marriage between that compliance side and that human side, it's going to be hard for us to kind of really accelerate out and really elevate the position to the strategic lever that it can be.
I think that people are afraid of the word sales or almost so many of us come from legal or audit or finance, and it's almost like sales is diametrically opposed, or it has this nasty connotation of sliminess, or, you know, we kind of, sometimes I've met compliance officers and legal people who feel like they're above it, essentially. And I feel like that's a really big problem that needs to be shifted in terms of our sensibility about our work.
Well, as I couldn't agree with you more. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's because salespeople are so non-compliant. They don't ever fill their paperwork out right. I don't know what it is. But it feels like a different spirit, and I get it. But, you know, like Zig Ziglar says, like, we're all in sales. You're selling yourself when you're at an interview, and you're selling yourself when you meet somebody for the first time. And those things need to go beyond the sort of day-to-day, you know, minor interactions. And I think as the light bulb goes on above people's heads, and they can see the benefit of bringing some of those sales techniques on, and maybe shedding some of that sliminess, as you called it, they can really accelerate. But I don't really know how to do it other than just kind of talking about it more and more.
I think that actually, in an ideal world, in my opinion, in 5 years' time, we'd have sales training coming to the compliance world. We would have those ideas about influence and persuasion. My experience is that compliance people really enjoy that kind of training, but that we need to educate even companies that that's something that they should be doing to skill up their people in the non-sales area to be salesmen.
So that's a great idea. How do we do that? Because I'd love to just do a little video series that I could put out on YouTube or on LinkedIn to kind of talk about some of these techniques in bite-sized pieces. And we all know that there are tons of sales books and so forth. That's again that bottom-up approach of a compliance officer maybe saying, you know what, I need to kind of work on my persuasion, and I'm going to go get a Cialdini book, and I'm going to kind of learn about this a little bit more. But from the top-down perspective, I love the idea of an organization recognizing, you know what, I need to kind of, what did you say? Kind of train them up in sales, some of these non-sales type people. How do we get them to make that type of an investment? Because those guys are so kind of analytical and like profit minded. How do we tie that sort of indirect benefit down to what they care about, which is maybe bottom line expansion or whatever?
Well, I mean, maybe we have to start with the compliance officers themselves. What you just said about YouTube and videos, I do a weekly 1-minute video of the wildly effective compliance officer tip of the week. But I think a series like you are talking about, maybe you can do, or someone can pick up. The biggest thing that I think I do is apply examples from the compliance world, because it's very difficult when you're talking about or reading about closing the sale. Or giving multiple options as to different pricing, good, better, best. Like, how do you apply that to compliance? And that is the bridge that I think if, I own a company, right? So I've now done a lot of sales training because I have to sell consulting or I don't have a job. And that learning curve for me was so strong and so high because I'd never done that either. And now looking at it from the other side, I can see the absolute benefit from it. But I think compliance people won't relate to it unless it's in a compliance in an environment where you're using examples that relate to them.
Yeah, I guess that's right. Maybe this is a bad analogy, but kind of cutting the food up for them and helping them to see kind of how to apply these versus just reading something that's geared for a salesperson and then having to make that sort of mental leap themselves. That's an easier way perhaps for them to kind of digest it and see the opportunity that's in front of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost impossible to read. I mean, Zig Ziglar talks a lot about, selling houses and things, and how do you relate that to trying to get your OFAC program funded? It's really, but it's the same thing, right? You're ultimately trying to sell the benefit to the individual. The benefit to the organization is hopefully not ending up with a sanctions violation and a multi-billion-dollar fine on some occasions. So, this is actually a thing where we're selling benefits, which is the same idea, but it's sometimes hard to see those relationships unless you really have them applied to the compliance world.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's great. Let's fast forward now. Let's, again, the crystal ball, don't know whether you have it. 10 years from now, what do you hope that we've been able to accomplish in the industry? What does our industry look like, and how is it different than what we're living in today on 2020?
There's two sides to that. The first one is the regulatory and legislative side, and the second is the compliance officer job. So from a regulatory legislative guidance perspective, my hope is that we get really, really good at this singularity idea, where the synergies of what does a good compliance program mean are the same in France as they are in Brazil, as they are in the UK and the US, that there really isn't tons of disparate advice, but it's more coalesced into a best practices and principles way of doing compliance. So I think that will be a huge shift, and I think we're going that direction. So I continue to hope that both in the privacy and compliance world we get there. Sanctions is always going to be a bit weird because people are always going to have fights back and forth, but for the rest of it, I think that we can manage that. And from a compliance professional perspective, the kind of technology that we're seeing, the significantly better training, it's not amazing yet, but we can get better at it. The sort of gamification elements and the competition elements and the micro learning and all that, I think we're going to see a lot more adult education technique, particularly in training. I think we're going to see a lot more infographics and a lot more use of technology, particularly for metrics and risk assessments, and a lot more live capacity to use that technology. That frankly, there is still more spreadsheet use than you would ever believe at major companies. I think that's going to have to go away, and that we have to get proficient when we're not at the technology piece.
That is, yeah, it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. You know, just to date myself a little, when I first came out of school, I was so excited to see what, you know, how proper businesses were run. And I started to see them, and it was like, oh, this is crazy. This is not how I thought it would look. Okay. Yeah, there's spreadsheets everywhere. It's insane. And, you know, sometimes, as ironic as it is, sometimes it's the people who are, you know, pushing these privacy policies, they're violating them themselves as they're sending spreadsheets around.
Oh my God. Data retention policies they shouldn't even bother being written because no one follows them.
Yeah, it's crazy.
You just don't.
So, let's say I'd love a piece of advice for two different people. One is someone who's just kind of getting into this compliance game. They want to make a difference. What kind of advice would you have for them? And then also for somebody who's kind of been in the game for a while, and maybe they've become a little bit jaded as they've moved up. They've been pigeonholed a little bit or whatever. What sort of advice would you give these folks? Because you are kind of at both of these points, I'd imagine, or at least have seen these different kind of archetypes at various points in your career. What can you give them to digest, to kind of accelerate themselves forward and be more effective? Other than buy your book, because right. that's assumed. Okay.
That was not going to be my advice, but I do appreciate that advice. The newbies, it's really, to a certain degree, it's the same advice for both. I'll separate it. For the newbies, it's 100% get in your network. Just start to meet people. There is nothing more effective for your career development than knowing people, knowing more senior people, going to conferences, listening to the advice of others. There is so much out there. I'm on the board of the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, and their conferences, their magazine, their blog, just there's so much great information. And start there, because whatever company you're in, I promise you, you don't have a full view of what everyone else is doing, right? So learn from others. For the more senior people, when you start to get jaded, and that happens a lot, I think trying to learn a new skill or a new area is really a good way to go about it. So I've met a lot of people who they've been ABAC or, you know, anti-bribery specialists for the last however many years. They're so sick of third-party due diligence and gifts and hospitality. If they can take a course and really learn something about sanctions, or go get their, you know, SIP certification for the privacy world, not only are you upskilling yourself, but you're giving yourself a new challenge and a new group to network with. And I think that will also put you in good stead if you need a new job. So I think that the more you can expand your knowledge set, the more challenged you can be, and the more you set yourself up for the next opportunity.
That's phenomenal advice. Just to break out of the monotony of whatever's causing them to be jaded. I mean, I guess you just have to do something different if you want a different outcome, to your point.
Absolutely.
How can people find you?
So my personal website, or the place that I blog, is www.compliancekristy, and Kristy is KRISTY.com. That's where I write and put out a lot of information to try to help the compliance officer in his or her job. And the consulting part of my world, the bigger company is Spark Compliance. That's www.sparkcompliance.com.
Well, thank you so much. This was phenomenal. This was everything I hoped it would be and more. I think we got some great actionable stuff. You bring such a unique perspective to this game. You bring such a unique energy, and you know, a lot of credibility and just great information. So I just thank you so much for making time for us, and I look forward to seeing you at the next conference.
I appreciate it. Take care, Nick.
All right, take care.